Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti a questo primo club dell'Osservatorio Design Thinking for Business. È un piacere conoscervi e incontrarvi per la prima volta, siete tanti e tante, e in particolare oggi abbiamo un primo momento appunto a porte chiuse solo per partner e sponsor. Qui vedete appunto la squadra ben nutrita con diverse prospettive e siamo pronti ad affrontare un anno tutto insieme. Adesso vedevo appunto in chat un po' anche le dinamiche che non sono così del tutto note, ma state tranquilli e tranquille, vi guideremo attraverso tutto il percorso nel corso dell'anno. In particolare oggi è il primo momento, appunto il primo club. Parleremo di design, creatività e sperimentazione. Insieme a noi ci sono già Sebastian Fixson e Tucker Marion, che poi verranno introdotti e avranno il loro spazio per raccontarci un po' le ricerche che stanno facendo su questo tema. Tutto questo all'interno di una comunque serata, un paio d'ore abbastanza intense, nel senso che ci troviamo adesso appunto nella parte iniziale in cui vi sto accogliendo al meglio che posso, spero. Vi racconterò un attimo due iniziative che stiamo portando avanti che possono essere utili anche per voi, per approfondire quanto come osservatorio stiamo facendo. Dopodiché invece avremo spazio appunto per il talk, un momento per voi per fare delle domande ai nostri speaker. E poi, come ci scrivevate in chat, vi ho mandato un invito a una stanza parallela, quindi un secondo calendar che si sovrappone proprio in partenza alle 18:55, in cui a valle dell'Ask Me Anything session vi chiederò di recarvi per ascoltare una delle tre perspective session. Le perspective session sono tre momenti in cui nel primo Access Digital, nel secondo Curio for Wonders e nel terzo il Politecnico vi racconteranno un po' quello che si sta portando avanti come riflessione proprio all'interno di queste realtà. Ci troveremo poi nuovamente in questa stanza in plenaria alle 19:25 per vedere un po' quello che è successo nelle altre stanze, quindi voi ne avrete una a cui potrete partecipare, ma ci sarà poi il modo di poter vedere anche quello che è successo nelle altre stanze e poi un saluto conclusivo in cui Gianluca Carella vi saluterà dopo aver facilitato la stanza ricordando gli appuntamenti che ci aspettano. Parto con una delle news che invece riguarda un po' l'attività di quest'anno. Stiamo realizzando, a breve vi lanceremo anche attraverso comunicazione con i referenti delle diverse aziende partner e sponsor, due repository. Il primo è un sito web solo per voi, quindi solo per partner e sponsor, in cui avrete modo di vedere tutto quello che è stato fatto evento per evento, quindi possibilità di scaricare i diversi report, lo scheduling delle attività, il programma di quell'evento. Il kick-off è già stato completato, l'abbiamo fatto a giugno con un pool ristretto di alcuni membri di ciascun partner e sponsor. Oggi siamo al primo club, per ora vedete solo il programma, verranno poi aggiunti diversi aspetti, quindi vi raggiungeremo anche con questo che è un po' un repository che ha la volontà di ovviare a link Dropbox che ogni tanto in alcune aziende non funzionano e cercare di darvi il più possibile un supporto nel collezionare tutto quello che avviene durante l'anno. In parallelo, vedete qui, c'è anche la possibilità di approfondire un po' la ricerca. Noi mentre stiamo raccogliendo una serie di articoli, ma anche lavorando molto su un database che vuole andare a raccogliere tutte le applicazioni di Generative AI che incontriamo, siamo arrivati a mapparne quasi 400, in una pagina Notion, che poi appunto attraverso il link che vi distribuirò nell'arco delle prossima settimana, potrete accedere per poter poi appunto interagire con questo database in cui troverete le diverse app classificate secondo alcune caratteristiche. Può essere uno strumento che speriamo vi possa aiutare. In parallelo, evento per evento, una serie di articoli, di pubblicazioni che legate all'evento vi possono aiutare anche ad approfondire la tematica. Io qui mi fermo, vi ridò un caloroso benvenuto all'inizio di questo percorso che ci vede insieme per 6 eventi, 2 club, 2 jam, 2 lab. Oggi è il primo club, il primo di una serie e lascio direttamente a Cristina introdurre i nostri due ospiti di oggi.
Grazie Stefano, grazie per le introduzioni e benvenuti a tutti. È bello vedervi così numerosi nonostante l'ora, quindi spero che vi accompagneremo come al solito in questo aperitivo culturale in modo piacevole. Partiamo subito con il botto perché appunto partiamo con una talk da parte di Sebastian Fixson e Tucker Marion, che come ci anticipava già Stefano sono due personalità, due professori molto importanti, ma visto che sono appunto degli ospiti internazionali, passerei all'inglese appunto per essere più inclusivi. Quindi, welcome, Sebastian Tucker. Welcome to this session. I will just briefly introduce you to the audience, which is very, populated, as you can see, despite the hour. So welcome. Sebastian is an Associate Dean of Graduate Programs and Innovation at Babson College, whereas Tucker is Associate Professor at Northeastern University. They've been working together in several publications in academic journals, but also in a book as co-authors and co-creators in the book titled The Innovation Navigator. What they will talk about today is design thinking in the world of AI. So without further ado, I leave you guys the spotlight for, having this very interesting talk. Thank you again. Oh, by the way, yes, I knew it, sorry. Ripasso all'italiano per ricordarvi che, come al solito, abbiamo un Pollev che vi permette di proporre delle domande ai nostri speaker. Questo Pollev è semplice, adesso qualcuno vi introdurrà sulla chat il link che potete cliccare per appunto sottomettere le vostre domande per i nostri speaker. Sorry guys, I just remembered that we also have a brief link to share with the audience for them to collect basically the questions that they may have, because afterwards we will have an Ask Me Anything session. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the introduction, Christina. Can you confirm that you can see the slides?
Absolutely, yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for having Tucker and myself at your event. This is really exciting for us to be here. As Christina pointed out, Tucker and I have been working together for over a decade on a variety of projects, and most recently exploring the aspect of the influence of digital tools in general on the innovation process. So when the team, Stefano, Claudia, and the team came to us and asked us to talk to you today, it was a narrower focus on the issue of design thinking in the world of AI. And so what Tucker and I am going to do is we're going to tag team. I will take on the first half roughly, and then Tucker will take on the second half. And what we have prepared is really a series of examples and a few early data points. And as you all know, as we all experience every day, this field is rapidly evolving. So no one at this point has final answers. But we hope that these examples give some food for thought for the area in which you're working in. So with that introduction, 2 weeks ago when I was traveling to a conference, I ended up in the magazine stand on the airport and bought these two magazines, which each had a story from quite different ends of this issue of AI. You see in the Foreign Affairs, there's an article about the AI power paradox, which talked about the question of how to control AI on an international level, right? And if we see how difficult it is to control anything on the international level, that the author posed quite a challenge what the humanity sort of has in front of us. And then the other piece in Wired talked about the move from OpenAI as a non-profit towards a for-profit de facto organization and what that meant for the incentive schemes. And taking these two together, I think demonstrates the scale of the challenge we have with us as a society on the whole. But we can also see that individual players drive this process very significantly, right? So, for example, in PitchBook, sort of a American source on all kinds of entrepreneurial and investment activities, you can see that by far AI is the largest area where the investment is flowing. Now, this is the category of general AI, so not only generative AI, but just the scale of the dominance is quite interesting. Now, for today, we wanted to talk more about sort of the innovation piece itself. And you can see that even in that space, McKinsey's Global Institute that collects a lot of data. In this graph, what you can see is the impact they estimate the introduction and significant use of AI has in several functions. And you can see that product R&D, which is probably the closest of sort of what this group is working on, is clearly in the upper half, over $300 billion in its estimate. And so what Tucker and I thought is then perhaps it's helpful to think about sort of different angles at which AI is expected to influence the innovation work and design included. And so we grouped them into two categories, right? So the first, we want to talk about some issues around task, what type of task, and how it reacts differently if AI is implemented. And then some people issues, both individuals as well as teams, as well as how this happens over time and how the individuals perceive that inside of the process. And then the second half, I will hand over to Tucker to talk more about different types of tools and different types of outcomes. So how much can you tolerate if the outcome is wrong? Excuse me. As well as ending sort of with a view on the double diamond that you all probably work with on a daily basis to have a conversation where in the process phase different AI tools may be useful. So let me start by showing you a data set from an experiment that colleagues of us at Wharton did just a few months ago. The working paper just came out this month. And so what they basically did, they looked at, in this case, student projects. So an entrepreneurship course where the student produce ideas to pitch new venture ideas. And so they had a large bank of these that they accumulated over the years. And now what they did is they went with the same prompt that essentially the students got and gave it to ChatGPT, first without any example training, and then with a little bit of example training. So then they had humans compared the anonymized results. And so the fundamental question here is, if this is an idea generation process, how do humans compete with AI tools? And so what you see is, so the first question is, who can do work faster or do more? And on that efficiency level, there's really no competition. It is not quite orders of magnitude, but you see the factor of 40 there in their little experiment, assuming sort of typical payments for and speed with which humans can work. They identify it's about a factor of 40 by which AI is more productive. Right? The second question obviously is, and that is not as important, if not more important, is what about the outcome quality, right? And so that's the label here, effectiveness. And they measure this in two ways. One is, and I've shown in other research that is a useful measure, the purchase intent. So again, you asked humans on a scale of how much likely they would to buy this product or service if it existed. So what you see on the left panel are the averages and distributions of the scores of these ideas. And you see that the averages climb from the humans in the leftmost column to the GPT-4 baseline to the GPT prompted with examples. But even more important is if you look at the red dots as a distribution, right? Remember, if we're looking at innovation, we're not really interested in the average idea. We're interested in the best or the top. And so in that aspect, you see that the variance, especially in the top, is larger on the GPT-produced ideas. So what this researcher team then did, they said, okay, if we take the top 10% of our 400 ideas in our pool from all three sources, of these 40 ideas on the top, 5 come from humans and 35 from GPT. Right, so that suggests that even on the quality idea, at least in this simple, relatively simple setting, GPT outcompetes humans. The panel on the right is an additional test where they asked for humans' assessment of novelty. And there it's slightly flipped, although statistically not particularly significant. And there's the question, also there's a spurious relationship between novelty and actual commercial success. Right? So this is one example of the power of generative AI in the area of idea generation, if you will. Another recent study that led to a more dense working paper from colleagues at Harvard and Wharton and some other schools in collaboration with Boston Consulting Group, led to so these diagrams you can find in a web post on their website from a few days ago. And in their study, they used consultants inside the company, right? So it's no longer students, it's real life. And the tasks they modeled after the typical tasks that these types of management consultants do on a daily basis. And then they had them run sort of a baseline task to have a baseline performance for each person. And then they had them two different tasks. One was sort of a creation task. In this case, it was a shoe company and it needed new models. And then another, it was a more business problem solving task that had a right answer that was sort of hidden in the diverse data set. And what you're looking at here is sort of the outcome of this, right? So relative to the baseline performance on the creative task, I should say, so then they had people work without GPT and with GPT, ChatGPT as a tool, as a supporting tool. And if they were supported with this tool, they were 40%, you saw a 40% productivity improvement in the creation task, whereas it was actually a decline in the problem-solving task, right? And so the authors in this particular article talk about that they think at the current moment that the frontier of ChatGPT is what they call jagged. So it's not a continuous curve, but it has hills and valleys. And depending on if the task is outside of this, at the current performance level of ChatGPT, that's a big asterisk. But there might be tasks where currently it's disadvantageous to rely on ChatGPT too much. But if you're inside of this performance frontier, and it seems that innovation generation activities, at least on the idea level, are in that arena, you see dramatic performance differences. Now, they went then further and unpacked the data and asked the question, well, what if not everybody performs on the same level, right? So if you imagine you could, with the baseline task, you can line up people by performance level, you would get a line like this. And so the question now is, would the addition of ChatGPT lead to everybody on a lower performance level increasing more? So that leads to this bunching up effect. And this experiment seems to suggest that's the case, that the benefits from using ChatGPT for this type of task is larger for the initially lower performing individuals than for the top performing. But you can envision that it might be everybody increases the same way, so the distribution looks the same just on a higher level, or perhaps at some point, if you're really skillful, it produces a performer that is so much better than everybody else, right? So this is early data where they see this effect on the top right, this bunching up from the lower level. But given that at this point in time, not many people are really proficient in using ChatGPT, it's unclear what will happen if more training and expertise maybe stretches out this distribution. Right? It is, however, a signal that one of the reasons that ChatGPT has diffused so quickly is because it's so easy to use, right? The barrier of entry is so low. That's on the individual level. Now the question, there are other effects that they find. For instance, even if individual level performance increases by 40%, the diversity of the ideas of teams they've found actually decreasing. Now, is that an effect of initial use of ChatGPT? Could you do with more training and more prompts change that? Probably, but that's at least something to look out for if you work with these types of tools. Now, one interesting aspect is when they interviewed the participants after the fact and asked them what they would think will happen to their creative ability if they continue to use these types of generative AI tools. Here's what you see, that a large proportion felt it will actually decrease their creative skills over time. Now, this is an ex-ante assessment. Neither they nor anyone else knows that that's the case, but that's at least a perception of the people in the sample. And I would imagine that in industries like yours, where a lot of creative people work, that this is a serious concern that may have to be considered if we think about using these tools on a more regular basis. One other aspect I want to add to this notion of perception. So The previous slide talked about the anticipation of future creative ability. Right? This is a different study from a different set of researchers, but had them work with AI and human design teams. And what I want to point you to on the middle of the slide, you see two distributions, right? On the top, it looks like a bimodal distribution, and on the bottom, it looks like a normal distribution. And that's a very important piece, because on the bottom is the result of asking the designers about their own competence, and you get a normal distribution. That's what you would expect, right? But on the top, they were asked their confidence into the AI, and what you see there is some are very confident, most likely overconfident, and some are not trusting enough, have low confidence in the ability. Right? Now, this difference is driven by the own competence. As you can see, the bars on the right divides distributions in low and high performing teams, and they react to this question differently. But that is another individual psychological component that we need to take into account if we train people to use AI systems or co-work with them to be a productive pair, if you will. And then lastly, there's also the question, the confidence, what you have in the outcome and how do you use it, right? So earlier this year in March, when everybody was still, began trying to use ChatGPT, this is an article from an emergency room doctor who tried to use ChatGPT for diagnosis and found that in his world, with the large variety of cases that he comes in, the risk of a misdiagnosis was too high for him. So he stopped using that and that purpose. And sometimes the risk is really large. You might have heard about this case a few months ago in the United States, where a lawyer had ChatGPT write the brief for the court, and when the opposing side was trying, and it came with referenced cases. So in the United States, the legal system is built on prior cases. And when the opposing side was trying to research the cited cases, they noticed that the cases were made up. Right, so this whole case blew up, and the lawyer obviously looked like a fool, having submitted a brief with invented case material. Right? But the interesting thing is, on return to the story with the doctor, is that a month later, he wrote another post that he found a good use, which was writing a script that the nurses could use to explain difficult medical decisions to, in his case, the family of an elderly patient. And so then raises an interesting question, right? What is the outcome and use of the task? And that may make a very different distinction whether the current performance level of generative AI is a useful tool. So this is just sort of on the task and the perception level that we wanted to share with you a few examples. And now I will hand it over to Tucker, who can share with you some examples of tools that some of which he himself has designed and others we have sort of studied. Tucker?
Oh, thank you, Sebastian. To the next slide, that would be great. So in thinking about Sebastian's discussion on the use of AI, its impact on efficiency, effectiveness, the potential for rapid increases in new ideas. One of the things that we've been thinking about is where is that point of confidence in the result coming back, and that relates to some of the slides that Sebastian just went over. And if you think about trustworthiness of the result, you can think about there's applications that have low. You don't have to have ultimate confidence in the results, but sometimes you do. And on the other side, that actually goes into the tool itself, because ChatGPT is a general model. So if you ask it a question, it's going out and it's using its data set, which is very broad and very wide, to give you back a result. And that can be great for an ideation task if you wanted to have something on a business model, just for example, that example from the University of Pennsylvania. But there are other things that require a very high amount of trustworthiness. If I'm using generative AI to develop a critical component for a jet engine, I want to make absolutely sure that the result I can trust, and it's grounded in truth, absolute engineering first principle truth. So for example, if you use Autodesk Fusion 360 and you have topology, generative AI, right now the most state of the art is that you can maximize strength and minimize mass or weight within very specific constraints, because that's the state of the art of what we can do to have very trustworthy results. You can't optimize for strength, low mass, and issues with resonant frequency right now, because it's not possible. So we need to gauge when or where that is, and actually how much grounded truth is underlying those models. So if we go to the next slide, for ideation to discovery, Sebastian has a number of different examples that I went at, and in ideation, the beginning of any innovation process or design thinking phase, lots of ideas is what you want, and ChatGPT is obviously very effective at it. Underlying that large language model is a very massive data set with lots of diverse information. And if you're asking this prompt that we did a couple weeks ago, you give us an idea for a futuristic shoe, it comes out with some really interesting information. Now, of course, we don't know exactly where that information is being pulled from. It could be from a student project that was done a year ago. It could be from something that was posted on Adidas, but that amalgamation of that result that comes back to you could be interesting and spur the team for better results. And then you can take that and put it into DALL-E, and that text was put into DALL-E, and that shoe came out. But of course, that shoe kind of looks like an Adidas shoe, so we don't exactly know where that information is coming from. So there's a concern about trustworthiness of, is that really a great result? But in ideation to discovery, encouraging wild ideas and laddering and doing all that, rooted in design thinking, why not? It can't hurt and you might get an interesting idea from it. But if we go to the next slide, there are other parts of the innovation process where we might need it grounded in a little better data. And this is the project that our team at Northeastern is working on. And how do we embed customer needs into generative design? So, for example, if you use ChatGPT to uncover latent needs, it doesn't do a very good job at that. It actually always goes back to variations, very explicit things if you ask it. But so one of the things that we're working on is how do we better predict customer needs on specific attributes based on a training set that is domain specific. So in our particular example, our first demonstration is in shoes. So we have over 1 million product reviews on over 7,000 shoe models, and are using that data to predict with about 97–98% accuracy predicted customer sentiment on very particular needs: traction, fit, color, etc. We then use that input into generative design to generate design that is more grounded in ground truth of what customers want. So this is more of an expert model because we may want to have better results when we're generating concepts that at least have some attachment to user preference or user need. Ultimately, we're working on being able to extract latent needs from that data. So if we go to the next slide, sometimes that the use of general models like ChatGPT makes a lot of sense. But as a company, we might, and if we think about trustworthiness, we want to use the capabilities of ChatGPT, which is excellent at language fluency, looking at summarization, categorization, those sorts of things, but we want it to use the company's data. So in that way, you're leveraging the capability of the tool, but the data set is your own. So if you were to go to, let's say, for example, Accenture, they might be able to put in a custom solution that at its core is using ChatGPT, but the data that is feeding that is the own marketing data from the company, and ChatGPT is not going outside of that. It is only working its algorithms on your data. So that means that it has a fairly high level of trust in the outputs, and that's important. So let's go to the next slide. This is this upper quadrant here in engineering and design. And of course, this is the most challenging and also the least developed right now in terms of the tools available and what they can do. So we're still early on in what generative AI can do for engineering and design, even though we've made a lot of progress in things like simulation. So one of the examples that you might want to check out is Siemens SimCenter, which they can develop custom, expertly trained solutions on various simulations, from fluid dynamics to thermal things to mechanical tests and simulations. So this is a field that is really burgeoning in the engineering design community, and how do we translate that into actual solutions that can function because of the high levels of confidence and trust that you need in the output. So let's go to the next slide. So one of the things that we think about, from a design perspective is, here's the classic double diamond. And we have, on one side trying to articulate and define the problem space, and the other is when we go to the solution space, where can we use AI to help us? And this is from some of the work that we've been doing at Northeastern, is that there are many different types of AI tools, from large language models to different types of generative design like GANs. And there can be a different place that these have a better use than others during that process, as Sebastian had alluded to earlier in the peaks and valleys that study noted in the use of ChatGPT. So again, we're early on in this field, but there are indications that certain features and certain tools can be really impactful to different parts of the innovation process. So if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian after this slide, and he's going to wrap up with some questions for all of us as designers and engineers in the community of innovation, of what's ahead, what's next. And if we think forward, what does that look like in 5 years? We've already seen the progress over the last year and a half, but thinking forward to 2028, when you turn over your iPhone, will it say designed by Apple AI in California? Are we getting to that point that AI is so integral into the innovation process that it is a partner for us? So I'm going to hand it over to Sebastian, who's going to take us through some thought-provoking questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Tucker. So just to bring this sort of panoply of ideas and data points and some suggestions to a close, I want to use a paragraph from a paper that originated in your shop there at the Politecnico with Roberto as a lead author. This paper is 2 years old, or 3 in the publication, but it basically makes the argument that if innovation generation of ideas becomes no longer a competitive advantage for humans, it will shift, the focus needs to shift to the problem framing, to the articulation, to the meaning making up front. And I think that then leads to a higher level questions for all of us as designers, engineers, leaders in creative industries. In other words, what's the right metaphor to think about what AI is, right? Is it going to be a tool, like some people argue it's like the calculator, right? We no longer do lots of calculations, especially the large and difficult ones in our heads. We have a machine to do that. That's one way of looking at a world like this. Another one is to say, well, it becomes a collaborator. It's a team member. And that obviously leads to the question, who leads whom in this scenario, right? Now you see that different software companies are bringing out their generative AI-based products under the label Copilot. Now the term Copilot still means that the pilot runs the ship or controls the airplane, and the Copilot is the assistant. Yesterday I was in a talk where someone said, well, so far we are the Copilot to the AI, right? So there might be already a switch happening, and For certain tasks, obviously, we see a simple replacement, and maybe some of us or some tasks that are parts of our jobs will be completely replaced. I think that leads three questions for us as responsible. The first one sort of is, do we understand how it impacts work? And so here's an assessment from the McKinsey folks on the percentage of tasks that can be automated by 2030. So that's 7 years away. And you see on the third line, creatives and arts management, it's between 10 and 25%. Right? So that fundamentally raises the question, if we use it as a tool or as a collaborator, how do we want to use it, and what does it mean for us as workers, as co-workers? Secondly, it affects how we think about how we train people, right? Both in universities, but also in companies, in other organizations. And in this large chart, that's from the World Economic Forum from earlier this year, you see on the vertical skills, they are lined up with core skills today, and on the horizontal scales, it's the anticipation for 23 to 27, right? And if you look at in the horizontal axis, sort of more future looking, you will see that analytical thinking is the first, creative thinking, and the third one is AI and big data, right? So all of us, both in education as well as in firms, we will have to think about how to train people in the appropriate ways, obviously. And then thirdly, there's obviously the question with the products we put out in the world, right? Are they used, misused for surveillance, for manipulation, there are consequences that could be good or bad, right? That affects all of us inside the company as well as citizens. So what you see is a survey in the United States from Pew Research Center, and you look at the top three reasons, both on the excitement side as well as on the concerning side. They're not surprising, right? Loss of human jobs, surveillance, lack of human connection. So I think even in the output, if we design systems, services, products that contains any of this, that will have consequences that we need to think about. And with that, we come to an end with our short presentations. Thank you for your attention. We hope that was useful. And if we have a few minutes for questions, Christina, Tucker and I would be happy to answer them as we could.
Absolutely. We do have questions, and thank you again for the nice presentation. I already had the pleasure to hearing it, and I cannot get enough. So thank you again for sharing this with us. Yeah, so people have been asking some. Yeah, you can leave it on if you want, or if you want to remove it, absolutely. So we do have some questions from the audience, and the top rated one, I think that the first one goes a little bit, let's say, clashes a little bit with what Virganti Roberto said in his article. But basically, the first question is, how can generative AI support problem framing tasks rather than just problem solving ones? So this is a very first tough question, perhaps.
I mean, I think at this point we can only speculate, right? I think what the data suggests is simply confirming Roberto's assessment that the idea generation part can be at least supported, in some cases done better by generative artificial intelligence systems. I think it remains to be seen if the same system can outperform us in the framing part. I think in Roberto's work on meaning making, I think that he identifies that as an intrinsically human ability. I mean, given what ChatGPT is, right? It is a system that uses statistics to identify what's the next probable word, right? It's a system that doesn't think the way we are, the way we think. It uses an entirely different mechanism to produce stuff that, on many occasions, is useful and we can interpret it with meaning, right? As an answer fit to our initial questions or prompt. Now, can that mechanism produce new meaning for us? I think that's an empirical question. I think at this point no one knows, but I'm quite certain that someone in the world right now is trying to figure this out.
Well, it's a great question. Oh, sorry. Sebastian, I didn't mean to
go ahead, Tucker.
So a couple of first point is that, as I had mentioned earlier, ChatGPT is wonderful at categorizing and summarizing data that you give it. So as an example, for an NSF project that we were working on, we had hundreds of virtual sticky notes on various topics on a Miro board. And you can take that and put that directly into ChatGPT and categorize and prompt engineer down a very specific granular, what are the top 8 themes that are coming from this particular ideation session that was done by humans. That's a great efficiency tool, and it did a very good job, and we actually used many of its, many of the results from it, but that's data that was internal. It's not coming from outside. One of the things so that's 2, but second, if for problem framing from a design thinking perspective, now you're starting to get into the non-obvious, the latent generation of those insights, right? And that's in design thinking, that's one of the hardest things to do. So imagine a computer doing that. One of the things that our group is working on is we've done a number of studies with expert designers to try to understand patterns of creative thinking. And what are the associations that are making, what are the jumping off points that experts go from identifying and pairing things, and what does that result mean for the problem frame that they develop? So we've just recently, our PhD students have verified that it is possible that you could come up with an algorithm to do that, or at least point in that direction of better problem framing. The way ChatGPT currently works in its algorithms isn't set up to do that. So it's for latent need extracting, just how statistically it works does not do that. So it will, if you are to do problem framing in that way, there needs to be new algorithms to allow that to happen. But we do think that it's possible.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't know if I am relieved about, artificial intelligence being able to frame the problem or not, but we will see. And that's absolutely curious to know. I'm absolutely curious to know. So let's move on instead to the second question, the most voted one, which is going back to the BCG study. They compare creative product innovation and business problem-solving tasks. Design thinking mainly deal with ill-defined problems. Do you think that generative AI can perform differently dealing with well-defined and ill-defined creative challenges?
So I think in general, if the problem is well defined, you may not even have to go to generative AI, right? If you have powerful computers and enough data, you probably can, through enumeration, find solutions, or at least smart algorithms. For the ill-defined one, and I think the BCG case is more rooted in the solution being less obvious, but there was one. So I could see that a more trained and more purposefully used generative AI system can address them going forward. I think on the more open-ended question, it throws us back to the first question, right? What are we trying to solve, and who decides that? And what is the decision criteria to select? Is this problem better to work on versus the other one? So for that, then my question would be the same. I think given the progress over the last couple of months, I have a hard time not to believe that something like that is possible, even if it's currently not. But then still the question is, what is our role in imbuing values, right? Which problem is more important, be it resource allocation in a society or in a company? So I think it's a moving target. And at this point, I don't think anyone has a conclusive answer, but looking at the dynamic in the field, I think we will be more surprised than not.
Right. And just to follow on that, if we look at just creative image generation, right? So there are a number of different models, and I'll just pick one that's called generative adversarial networks, or GANs. So GANs, let's say, for example, if you're doing, I'll just go back to the shoe example. You can train a GAN and use 5,000 to 7,000 different images, and that's your data set. The output of the result of running new versions of those shoes, the way GANs work is that they want to get the most realistic model. So if you go to this person does not exist or the shoe does not exist, realism is that gate, right? So what that means is that you can have an endless variety of combinations of design attributes only within that data set, which is fine if you're thinking about incremental innovation. You might have a really interesting combination of Crocs and a running shoe that was in that data set. And that could be perfect for whatever application you're doing. But you're not necessarily going to have something that is out of that. You're not going to have something out of that data set to impact that image generation, like a car or a zebra or a cheetah. That's not the way those systems work. But there are different image generators, and there is a lot of work going on to improve the diversity and novelty of the output of some of those Gen AI things. So this is coming, and most likely you will have very tunable controls where you might be able to control the incremental versus radical output of those models.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think we still have a little bit of time for a third question, since we have collected so many. So the third question would be, is there a risk that excessive reliance on AI in the innovation phase might stifle creativity and lead to a cookie cutter approach rather than fostering genuine breakthrough?
So I think the risk is clearly there, as the data set from the BCG study shows, that individuals already saying, well, if I work this way, my creative fire will atrophy, right? On the other hand, you can envision using these tools as support tools and getting used to working with much larger number of options than we could internally create. And so you might construct a different argument by saying being exposed to such a variety of ideas and options on an ongoing basis is actually helpful in my work in being creative. So I think, yeah, there are arguments in either direction, and we will find out how we contribute to creating this world. But these are, I think, important thoughts if we sort of, as leaders, for instance, think about how to organize creative work, right? How do we train people? How do we support them using tools? How do we use the output of the tools in the creative work? All of this is up for a redesign. There's no question.
Absolutely. I don't know if Tucker, you want to add anything, or
yeah, there's thinking about this. So, and when you have a technology disruption, there are different ways, or ultimately how something actually plays out or adopted. So, for example, in the 1950s, with the rise of processed food, it was determined that yes, we can have frozen mac and cheese, which yes, we do have today, but customers and home cooks felt the most comfortable with having a hand in making that mac and cheese, boiling the water, working on the noodles, putting in the milk, and putting in the processed cheese powder and mixing it together. So I think that, it's interesting. We think forward 20 years, will people still be more comfortable with having a hand in some semblance of control of creative tasks rather than completely hands off? And that goes to Sebastian's thoughts on what is the right combination of tool, person, and organization and team. I still think it's very fluid. I do think that there will be certain applications that are completely lights out or hands off. but there will be many, particularly in creative fields, that humans will still have the desire to control at least some of the input and output.
I love this metaphor that you've just used about, the mac and cheese and still needing that human touch or that human control, let's say. So thank you truly for your contribution and for answering the question. Now I just wonder how many of this question were actually, the input was actually human, or was it ChatGPT? Now we're just left wondering. We will, we will analyze the question thoroughly to get the answer. So thank you very much again for your contribution and for participating, and also thank you to the audience for the wonderful questions and the participation again.
Thank you all.
Thank you for having us, and thanks for the good questions. Very interesting conversation.
Thank you. Okay, so we can switch back to Italian and also back to Stefano. Stefano.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian, thank you Cristina, thank you Tucker for all the session, and adesso ci muoviamo sull'italiano per lanciare le perspective session, quindi dopo questo momento che spero sia stato interessante per vedere anche un po' le ricerche che si stanno conducendo in giro per il mondo su questa tematica, vediamo che cosa succede nel panorama italiano e non solo. Quindi l'idea di andare in Assist, Digital, Curio for Wonders e anche Politecnico è proprio questo, di dividerci per vedere un po' alcune prospettive che stiamo analizzando. Come sapete avete scelto una delle sessioni a cui partecipare, quindi in qualche modo proprio all'interno del vostro calendar dovreste avere già la sessione in cui andare. In particolare in Assist Digital troverete Enrico Gallo-Migliozzi e Valeria Pireda che vi racconteranno un po' come Generative AI e Human Centered Design possono essere un po' bilanciati per creare ricerca e outcome. Curio invece Andrea Spalmach vi racconterà da cosa nasce cosa, quindi vi racconterà un po' come Generative AI e come tutto questo percorso di evoluzione ha portato Curio a diventare quella che è oggi, un'evoluzione molto interessante che non vi svelo ma vi lascio scoprire. E invece insieme a me nella stanza del Politecnico cercherò di raccontarvi un po' quelle che sono le ricerche anche qui che stiamo conducendo su questa tematica, provando a portarvi qualche spunto. Come sapete abbiamo di fronte a noi quella che è una mezz'oretta più o meno, quindi non mi dilungo, dovreste avere già il calendar, dovreste poter fluire nelle stanze. In caso di problemi, se qualcuno non dovesse riuscire a non avere il link, qualche collega si ferma sicuramente qui nell'attesa per potervi supportare nel entrare nelle diverse stanze. Quindi ci vediamo direttamente lì con la promessa di rivederci alle 19:25 in questa stanza, quindi potete metterla in pausa se volete oppure saltare direttamente e poi riaprirla per tirare un po' le file e vedere cosa è successo nelle altre perspective session rispetto a quella a cui parteciperete. A tra poco.